Dead America, The Soldier, The Day After, Part 1, by Derek Slayton. Chapter 1. The cargo plane touched down hard on a makeshift runway that had been carved out of a farmer's field just outside of Newton, Kansas. The jolt rattled through the fuselage, shaking loose a few unsecured crates that slid across the metal floor. Sergeant Flint gripped the webbing of his seat, steadying himself as the aircraft bounced twice more before the wheels found their footing on the compacted dirt. He looked across the cargo hold to Anne, who had her eyes closed and both hands wrapped around the straps of her harness. Captain Harris sat beside her, calm as ever, though Flint could see her knuckles had gone white around the armrest during the landing. The engines wound down and the rear loading ramp began to lower, flooding the hold with daylight and the sound of organized movement. Flint unbuckled himself and stood, stretching his legs after what had been a cramped and restless flight from Shreveport. Through the widening gap of the ramp, he got his first look at Newton. The small town had been transformed into a military staging area, every inch of it buzzing with purpose. Trucks rolled between rows of tents, soldiers jogged in formation, and the distant thump of helicopter rotors echoed from somewhere further south. It reminded Flint of the forward operating bases he had seen overseas, except this one was built on American soil, surrounded by wheat fields instead of desert. Captain Harris was the first one down the ramp, stepping out onto the dirt runway and surveying the scene with the trained eye of someone who had seen more than a few operations come together in a hurry. Anne followed close behind, squinting against the light as she took in the sheer scale of what was happening around them. Flint stepped off the ramp and took a deep breath. The air was cooler than Shreveport, carrying the faint smell of jet fuel and freshly turned earth. He adjusted the rifle slung over his shoulder and fell in beside Anne as the three of them walked toward a cluster of command tents at the edge of the field. Anne looked over at Flint, and for a moment neither of them said anything. They had known each other for only a handful of hours, but those hours had included driving a car off a dock into a river, so the usual small talk felt unnecessary. "So this is where we part ways," Anne said. "Looks like it," Flint replied. "Thank you, Flint, for everything back there," she said. "You kept your head when it counted. That's more than most people can say after what we went through," Flint said. Anne reached over and gave him a firm pat on the arm, the same gesture she had used in the raft. She gave him a small nod that carried more weight than any long goodbye could have managed. "Don't forget about that letter of recommendation," she said. "Wouldn't dream of it, Doc." Anne allowed herself a brief smile before a pair of soldiers approached, one of them carrying a clipboard. They addressed her by name, which meant someone had radioed ahead. She glanced back at Flint one last time before falling in with her escort and heading toward the medical tents on the far side of the staging area. Captain Harris stepped up beside Flint, watching Anne disappear into the organized bustle of the camp. "She's tougher than she looks," Harris said. "She didn't flinch when I drove our car off the end of a pier." "Tough doesn't begin to cover it," Flint replied. Harris let out a short laugh before her expression shifted back to business. She nodded toward the largest of the command tents, where a tall officer was stepping out to greet them. "That's General Larson. He's running the show down here," Harris said. "What's he like?" Flint asked. "Smart, deliberate, doesn't waste words or soldiers," Harris replied. "My kind of general," Flint said. General Larson approached with a measured stride, his posture relaxed but alert. He was older than Flint had expected, with close-cropped gray hair and a lean build that suggested he kept himself in fighting shape despite his rank. His uniform was clean but not pressed, indicating that appearances were secondary to the work being done. He extended his hand to Captain Harris first. "Captain Harris, glad to see you made it in one piece," the general said. "It wasn't for lack of trying on the other side, sir," Harris replied. Larson shook her hand before turning his attention to Flint, looking him over with a brief but thorough assessment. "And you must be Sergeant Flint." "Yes, sir," Flint replied, shaking the general's hand. "Captain Harris radioed ahead about you. She tells me you're the reason she and the doctor are standing here right now," Larson said. Flint glanced over at Harris, who gave him a slight nod. "I had a lot of help, sir," Flint said. "Modest. I like that in a sergeant," Larson replied. He turned back to Harris. "Captain, I need you to debrief with Colonel Haynes in the command tent. He'll get you squared away for the next rotation." "Yes, sir," Harris said. She turned to Flint, extending her hand. The handshake was firm and quick, the kind shared between soldiers who respected each other. "Stay alive out there, Flint." "You too, Captain." Harris walked off toward the command tent, leaving Flint standing with the general. Larson clasped his hands behind his back and began walking, motioning for Flint to fall and step beside him. "Walk with me, Sergeant." "Yes, sir." They moved through the staging area at an unhurried pace, Larson leading them between rows of supply trucks and personnel carriers. Soldiers moved around them with purpose, loading ammunition, checking equipment, and studying maps pinned to the sides of vehicles. "I'll be straight with you, Flint. We're spread thin down here. Wichita is a mess, and every team I send in comes back lighter than when they left. I've got operations running on every side of the city, and not enough experienced soldiers to lead them," Larson said. "What's the situation in the city, sir?" Flint asked. "Heavy concentration of those creatures downtown and along the eastern corridor. The flooding on the west side gave us a natural barrier, so we've been able to set up perimeters along the bridges and control the flow. But the east side is wide open, and we're losing ground every hour," Larson explained. Flint nodded, taking in the information. The general spoke with the calm precision of a man who had already processed the worst-case scenario and moved on to solving the problem. "I'm putting you with Captain Davis. He's leading a team into the city for a priority extraction," Larson continued. "What kind of extraction?" Flint asked. "We have a group of soldiers pinned down at the airport. They were part of the initial evacuation effort, got cut off when things went south. They've been holding position in the pilot's lounge for the better part of a day, but they're running low on everything," Larson said. "How many?" Flint asked. "Last count was 8, including a couple of pilots we need back in the air," Larson replied. The general stopped walking as they reached a smaller tent near the southern edge of the camp. A group of soldiers were gathered around the back of a truck, checking weapons and loading magazines. One man stood apart from the others, studying a map that was spread across the truck's tailgate. "Captain Davis!" Larson called out. The captain looked up from the map and walked over. Davis was in his mid-30s with a wiry frame and sharp features. He moved with efficiency, but Flint noticed something in the way he carried himself that seemed off. It was subtle, a slight tension in the shoulders, a quick darting of the eyes that came and went. The look of a man who was holding it together through sheer force of will. "General," Davis said, "this is Sergeant Flint, fresh in from Shreveport. Captain Harris vouched for him personally. He's your new number 2, Larson said. Davis looked Flint over for a moment before extending his hand. The handshake was firm, but brief. "Welcome aboard, Sergeant," Davis said. "Good to be here, Captain," Flint replied. Larson gave them both a nod. "Captain, the clock is ticking on those soldiers at the airport. Get your team briefed and in the air as soon as possible." "Yes, sir," Davis replied. The general turned to leave, then stopped and looked back at Flint. "Sergeant, Captain Harris told me what you did in Shreveport. Don't let me down in Wichita." "I won't, sir." Larson walked away, leaving the 2 men standing beside the truck. Davis watched the general go before turning back to Flint, with a look that suggested he had a lot on his mind, and not enough time to sort through it. "So, Shreveport, how bad was it?" Davis asked. "Bad enough that I showed up here with 3 rounds and a meat cleaver," Flint said. Davis let out a dry laugh, the kind that carried very little actual amusement behind it. "Yeah, that sounds about right for how things have been going." He led Flint over to the truck, where the rest of the team was gearing up. 4 soldiers looked up as they approached, each in various stages of preparation. "Listen up. This is Sergeant Flint. He's filling in as my second. Flint, meet the team." Davis pointed to each man as he introduced them. Corporal Morris was the first, a stocky soldier with a thick neck and calm eyes who gave Flint a respectful nod. He was the most squared away of the group, his gear already checked and secured. Private Rogers was next, younger than the others, with an eager look about him that suggested he hadn't yet had the enthusiasm beaten out of him. He gave Flint a quick wave before going back to loading magazines. Private Butler was a quiet one, solidly built with hands that looked like they belonged to a mechanic. He acknowledged Flint with a grunt and a nod before returning to the disassembly of his sidearm. Private Silva rounded out the group, a lean soldier who moved with a restless energy, as if standing still for too long made him uncomfortable. He shook Flint's hand with a grip that was stronger than his frame suggested. "Good to have you, Sergeant," Morris said. "Likewise, Corporal. How long have you all been on the ground here?" Flint asked. Since last night. We flew in from Fort Riley, Morris said. Flint looked over at Davis, who had gone back to the map on the tailgate. The captain was studying the layout of the airport, tracing routes with his finger, but his movements were distracted. He kept glancing at an empty spot beside the truck, as if expecting someone to be standing there. Flint stepped over to him, keeping his voice low enough that the others wouldn't hear. "Captain, you all right?" Flint asked. Davis didn't look up from the map right away. When he did, Flint could see the weight behind his eyes. The captain exhaled slowly before answering. "My sergeant. The one you're replacing. He had A-type blood," Davis said. The words hung in the air between them. Flint didn't need any further explanation. He had seen what happened to people with A-type blood, had watched it play out in real time back in Shreveport. The 72-hour clock was merciless, and it didn't care about rank or readiness. "I'm sorry, Captain," Flint said. He started showing symptoms on the flight in. By the time we landed, he could barely stand. They took him to medical, and that was the last I saw of him, Davis said. Davis straightened up and ran a hand across his jaw, pulling himself back to the present. The vulnerability vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the focused expression of a man with a mission to complete. "So, that's where we're at. I'm down my best man, operating in a city I've never been to, and we're about to fly into what I'm told is a war zone. But those soldiers at the airport have been waiting long enough, so we're going to get them out," Davis said. "Just tell me what you need, Captain," Flint said. Davis nodded and called the rest of the team over to the map. The 4 soldiers gathered around the tailgate as the captain laid out the situation. "All right, here's what we know. We've got 8 friendlies holed up in the pilot's lounge at the airport on the east side of the city. They've been there since yesterday, and they're running low on ammunition and supplies. Our job is to get in, link up with them, and get everybody out alive." Davis pointed to the map, tracing the route from their current position down to Wichita. "We're flying in by helicopter. It's roughly 25 miles, so we'll be on site fast. The airfield itself is overrun, so we won't be landing there. We'll touch down at the shopping center just across the highway on the west side. From there, we move on the ground to the airport." "What kind of resistance are we looking at?" Morris asked. "Heavy. The east side of the city has no natural barriers, so those things have been moving through it without anything slowing them down. Expect large numbers and expect them to be fast," Davis replied. The group fell quiet for a moment as the reality of what they were about to walk into settled over them. Rogers stopped loading his magazine and looked up, his earlier eagerness tempered by the captain's briefing. "How are we getting from the shopping center to the airport?" Rogers asked. "There's a National Guard unit running operations at the bridges between downtown and the east side. They'll have ground vehicles for us. We take 2 SUVs, drive onto the airfield, and push to the south side where there's a baggage loading area. That's our entry point into the terminal," Davis explained. "And our exit?" Flint asked. "Same way we came in, assuming the route stays open," Davis said. "And if it doesn't?" Flint pressed. Davis looked at him for a moment, then shrugged. "Then we figure it out on the fly. Wouldn't be the first time today." Flint gave a slight nod, appreciating the captain's honesty. He had worked with officers who promised certainty when there was none to be had. Davis didn't seem like that kind of leader. "All right, finish gearing up. We're wheels up in 15 minutes, Davis ordered. The team broke from the map and went back to their preparations with renewed urgency. Flint grabbed a fresh set of magazines from a supply crate and began loading them, replacing the near-empty ones he'd carried all the way from Shreveport. As he worked, Davis stepped beside him and handed over a sheathed knife. "Figured you could use a proper blade, since I'm told you've been getting by with kitchen utensils," Davis said. Flint took the knife and turned it over in his hands. It was military issue, nothing fancy, but a significant upgrade from the meat cleaver that had kept him alive through the night. "I appreciate it, Captain. Though I have to say, I'm going to hang on to the cleaver, just in case," Flint replied. "I understand, Sergeant," Davis said. The captain gave him a brief nod before walking off to finalize the helicopter arrangements, leaving Flint to finish his preparations. The sergeant slid the knife onto his belt and went back to loading magazines, his mind already shifting to the fight ahead. 15 minutes, then Wichita. Chapter 2. The helicopter lifted off from the staging area, the rotor wash flattening the grass in a wide circle beneath them as they climbed into the sky. Flint sat in the rear cabin beside Rogers, with Davis, Morris, Butler, and Silva spread across the bench seats opposite them. The noise made conversation difficult, so the team communicated through hand signals and the occasional shout over the engine. Flint watched Newton shrink below them as the helicopter banked south. From the air, the military's footprint on the small town was even more apparent. Rows of tents, vehicle depots, and makeshift landing pads stretched across what had been farmland less than 48 hours ago. Beyond the perimeter, the Kansas countryside looked untouched, flat fields of green and brown rolling out to the horizon in every direction. It was hard to believe that 25 miles ahead, a city was tearing itself apart. The pilot's voice crackled through the headsets that hung on hooks along the cabin wall. Davis grabbed the nearest set and pressed one ear cup against his head so he could hear over the rotors. "Captain, I'm going to bring us in from the northwest so you can get a look at the layout before we set down," the pilot said. "Copy that." "What can you tell us about the ground situation?" Davis asked. "You're going to want to see it for yourself, sir, but here's the short version. The heavy rains over the last couple of days flooded the big ditch on the west side of town. Water's sitting about 4 feet above normal in most places, which means those things can't cross it on foot. That gave the guard units enough breathing room to set up perimeters along the bridges." "So the west side is contained?" Davis asked. "Mostly. The bridges are the choke points. As long as we hold those, nothing gets across from downtown. But it's a constant fight. Every time the boys on the ground think they've got a lull, another wave shows up." Davis relayed the information to the team, shouting over the engine noise. Flint absorbed the details, trying to build a mental picture of the city's layout based on what the pilot was describing. A flooded channel on the west acting as a natural moat, bridges serving as the only crossing points, and the east side wide open with no such advantage. It explained why the airport had been overrun so quickly. The helicopter continued south, the flat terrain below giving way to the first signs of suburban development on the outskirts of Wichita. Neighborhoods appeared, the houses getting closer together as they pushed deeper toward the city center. From altitude, the streets looked quiet at first, but as they descended lower, Flint could see vehicles scattered at odd angles throughout the intersections, and the occasional dark shape moving between buildings. "Coming up on downtown now," the pilot announced. The skyline of Wichita rose ahead of them, a modest cluster of office buildings and towers that would have looked unremarkable on any other day. Today, columns of black smoke rose from at least 4 different locations, the fires burning unchecked, with no one left to fight them. The smoke drifted east on the wind, creating a dark haze that hung over the lower sections of the city like a shroud. As the helicopter dropped altitude and swung east to give them a closer look, the full scope of the destruction became visible. Entire city blocks were wrecked, cars piled up at intersections where panicked drivers had created gridlock before abandoning their vehicles. Storefronts had their windows smashed in, and debris littered the streets. A city bus sat jackknifed across a main road, its doors hanging open, streaks of dried blood running down the steps. Flint pressed closer to the window, scanning the ground below. He spotted movement on a rooftop several stories up. 3 people were standing near the edge, waving their arms at the helicopter. One of them was holding a bedsheet with large letters painted across it, though from this angle and speed, Flint couldn't make out the words. Rogers saw them too, leaning across Flint to get a better look. "Are we going to help those people?" Rogers asked. Davis shook his head. "We can't. Not today." Rogers started to say something else, but stopped when he saw the look on the captain's face. It wasn't indifference. It was the expression of a man who had already made the calculation and hated the answer. Davis keyed the radio and spoke to the pilot. "Mark that rooftop location and relay it back to command. There are survivors up there," Davis said. "Copy that, Captain. They're not the only ones. I've been marking positions all morning. Last count was about a dozen groups like that, scattered throughout the city," the pilot replied. Nobody in the cabin said anything after that. Flint looked away from the window and caught Silva staring at the floor between his boots, his jaw clenched tight. Butler was checking his rifle for the 3rd time since they had taken off, giving his hands something to do while his mind processed what they were flying into. Morris sat still, his expression unreadable, watching the city pass by with the detachment of someone who had already decided that emotions would have to wait. The helicopter continued east, passing over the heart of downtown. Below them, the streets were filled with creatures. Dozens of them moved in loose packs, sprinting between buildings and converging on any sound or movement. Flint watched a group of at least 30 ghouls pour out of a parking garage, racing across an intersection towards something he couldn't see from the air. Further down the block, another cluster was swarming around a delivery truck that had crashed into the front of a restaurant. Whatever had drawn them there initially, they showed no signs of losing interest. "There," Davis said, pointing toward the western edge of downtown. Flint followed the captain's finger and saw the bridges. 3 of them spanned the flooded channel within his field of view, and each one was a battlefield. Military vehicles were positioned at the western ends, forming barricades out of trucks, concrete barriers, and anything else heavy enough to block the road. Soldiers were dug in behind the barricades, and even from the helicopter, Flint could see muzzle flashes popping off in rapid succession. On the eastern side of the nearest bridge, a mass of creatures was pushing toward the barricade. The zombies moved in a swarm, climbing over each other in their frenzy to reach the soldiers on the other side. Bodies were piled up along the bridge deck, where previous waves had been cut down, but the creatures behind them used the fallen as stepping stones, scrambling over the dead without slowing down. A heavy machine gun opened up from one of the barricade positions, the sound reaching the helicopter as a distant hammering. The rounds tore through the front ranks of the horde, dropping creatures in clusters, but more kept coming from the streets beyond. For every ghoul that fell, 2 more appeared from behind a building or out of an alleyway, drawn toward the noise of the battle like moths to a flame. On the second bridge, the situation looked even worse. The barricade had taken damage, one of the trucks pushed back several feet by the sheer weight of the creatures pressing against it. Soldiers were firing from elevated positions on top of their vehicles, trying to keep the ghouls from spilling around the sides of the barrier. Spent shell casings rained down onto the bridge deck, glinting in the daylight as they bounced and scattered. "That's been going on since we set up the perimeters," the pilot said. "They just keep coming. The boys down there have been rotating shifts and burning through ammo at a rate that's got logistics sweating." "How long can they hold?" Davis asked. "As long as the ammunition lasts, they can hold the bridges. The water does the rest. But if supply gets interrupted, or if one of those bridges gets overrun, the whole west side opens up," the pilot replied. Flint watched the firefight play out below as the helicopter continued past the bridges and toward the east side of the city. The difference was stark. On the west side of the channel, there was order, structure, and soldiers fighting from prepared positions. On the east side, there was nothing. No barricades, no perimeters, no organized resistance. Just a sprawling urban landscape that belonged to the dead. The pilot banked south, and the airport came into view. It was a large commercial facility with multiple runways, terminal buildings, and support structures spread across a wide area. Under normal circumstances, it would have been the ideal staging point for operations. But the airfield was crawling with creatures. Flint could see hundreds of them scattered across the tarmac, wandering between abandoned aircraft and ground vehicles. Some were clustered around the terminal building, pressing against doors and windows. Others moved aimlessly across the runways, drawn to every sound and sprinting after birds or blowing debris before losing interest and resuming their directionless patrol. "That's why we're not landing at the airport," the pilot said. "We'd be swarmed before you got out of the bird." "Where's the lounge?" Flint asked. Davis pointed to a section of the terminal on the north side of the complex. "The pilot's lounge is in there, second floor. Our people are holed up behind a security door, but the terminal around them is full of those things," Davis said. "So we have to fight through the terminal to reach them," Flint said. "That's the idea," Davis confirmed. The pilot swung the helicopter further south and began descending toward a large shopping center that sat just across a 4-lane highway from the airport's western perimeter. The supercenter's parking lot was mostly empty, with only a scattered handful of abandoned cars dotting the expanse of asphalt. A few creatures were visible near the store's entrance, but the lot itself was relatively clear compared to the nightmare on the airfield. "Setting down at the supercenter looks relatively clear from up here, but stay sharp on the approach," the pilot said. Flint checked his rifle and tightened the strap on his slung cleaver, making sure everything was secure for a quick exit. Across from him, the rest of the team was doing the same, checking magazines, adjusting gear, and preparing themselves for what they were about to walk into. Rogers was fidgeting with the strap on his helmet, tightening and loosening it in a nervous repetition. Morris reached over and slapped his hand down, giving the younger soldier a look that said to knock it off. Rogers took a breath and steadied himself. The helicopter dropped fast, the pilot bringing them in at a steep angle to minimize their time at low altitude, where they would be most vulnerable. The supercenter rushed up toward them before the pilot flared the aircraft at the last moment, bleeding off speed and settling onto the parking lot with a heavy bounce. "Go, go, go!" Davis shouted. The team was out of the helicopter before the skids had fully settled, boots hitting the asphalt as they fanned out into a defensive perimeter. Flint moved to the right with Rogers, while Morris, Butler, and Silva spread left. Davis dropped out last, slapping the side of the helicopter twice to signal the pilot. The rotors spun up to full power as the aircraft lifted off, climbing fast and banking away to the north. Within seconds it was gone, the sound of the engine fading as it disappeared over the rooftops, leaving the 6 soldiers standing in the parking lot with the massive store at their backs and the airport visible just across the highway. The area around them was quiet for the moment, but Flint could see shapes moving in the distance. Several creatures on the far edge of the parking lot had taken notice of the helicopter's arrival and were now making their way toward the team's position. Their pace was fast, covering ground at a dead sprint with their arms swinging wildly at their sides. "Captain, we've got company, far side of the lot, moving fast," Flint reported. Davis turned and assessed the approaching threat, counting at least 5 creatures bearing down on them from different angles. They had come from between parked cars and around the corners of the building, converging on the spot where the helicopter had touched down. "Don't engage unless they get within 50 yards. We don't need to announce ourselves to the whole city," Davis ordered. The team held their positions, rifles raised and tracking the approaching ghouls. The creatures closed the distance with alarming speed, their mouths hanging open as they ran. Blood stained their clothes and skin, and their eyes carried the same vacant, dead look that Flint had seen in Shreveport. At 60 yards, Flint could make out the torn flesh on the nearest creature's neck and the way its jaw hung at a wrong angle, as if it had been broken and never reset. At 50, Davis gave the order. "Drop them." 6 rifles fired in near unison, the controlled bursts cutting down the lead creatures before they could close the remaining distance. The ghouls behind them stumbled over the fallen bodies, slowing their approach just enough for the team to pick them off with follow-up shots. Each round found its mark, skulls snapping back as bullets tore through bone and brain. Within seconds, all 5 were down, dark pools spreading beneath them on the hot asphalt. The echo of the gunfire rolled across the parking lot and out toward the highway. Flint scanned the perimeter, looking for any additional threats that might have been drawn by the noise. He could see more shapes beginning to move in the distance, figures emerging from behind the supercenter and from the direction of the highway. "That's going to bring more of them," Flint said. "Then we better not be here when they show up," Davis replied. "Let's move. The guard unit at the bridge should be just south of here." The team fell into formation, Davis on point with Flint covering the rear, and they began double-timing it across the parking lot toward the highway and the sounds of battle that echoed from the bridges beyond. Chapter 3. The team crossed the highway at a sprint, staying low as they moved between abandoned vehicles that littered the road. The sounds of the bridge battle grew louder with every step, the steady crack of rifle fire punctuated by the deeper thumping of a heavy machine gun. Davis led them south along a service road that ran parallel to the highway, following the noise until the nearest bridge came into full view. The barricade was more impressive up close than it had been from the air. 2 large military trucks sat nose to nose across the bridge deck, with concrete barriers filling the gaps on either side. Sandbag positions were built up behind the trucks, and soldiers moved between them with purpose, firing in controlled bursts before ducking back to reload. A soldier broke from the barricade and jogged toward them as they approached, waving them in behind a concrete wall that served as the staging area. He was covered in dust and sweat, his uniform dark with stains that could have been dirt or blood or both. The name tape on his chest read, Conrad. "Captain Davis?" the soldier called out. "That's me. You must be Sergeant Conrad," Davis replied. "Yes, sir. General Larson radioed ahead that you were coming. I wish I had better news for you," Conrad said. "Let's hear it," Davis said. Conrad led them behind the wall, where a map of the airport had been spread across the hood of a truck. The edges were held down with spent shell casings, and several areas had been circled in red marker. "Here's where we stand. The airport is a mess. We had a team holding the main entrance on the west side, keeping a corridor open for potential evacuations. But they've been burning through ammunition all day trying to keep those things from overrunning the position," Conrad explained. "How long can they hold?" Davis asked. "They can't. I just got word that they're pulling back within the hour. They're down to their last few magazines, and they've got wounded that need to get out," Conrad said. Davis studied the map for a moment, then tapped the entrance with his finger. "That's our way in. If they're still holding when we get there, we can use their position as a foothold and push into the terminal," Davis said. "You'd have to move fast, Captain. Once they pull out, there's nothing keeping those things from flooding the entrance," Conrad said. "Then we won't waste any time. What do you have for vehicles?" Davis asked. Conrad pointed toward a row of military SUVs parked behind the barricade. Several of them showed damage from previous runs, dented panels, and cracked windshields, but they looked operational. "Take your pick. Keys are in the ignition on all of them. Just bring them back in one piece if you can, because I'm running out of spares," Conrad said. "No promises," Davis replied. He turned to the team, who had been listening to the exchange while keeping one eye on the bridge. "All right, here's how we're doing this. 2 vehicles. Flint, you're driving the lead with Rogers and Morris. I'll take the second with Butler and Silva. We push through the entrance while their team is still holding it, then drive straight across the airfield to the south side. There's a baggage loading area down there that should give us access to the terminal." "And if the entrance team is already gone by the time we get there?" Flint asked. "Then we drive through whatever's in our way," Davis said. Flint nodded and looked over to Rogers and Morris. Both men gave him a nod in return, ready to move. The team split up and made their way to the SUVs, loading in and starting the engines. Flint slid behind the wheel of the lead vehicle, adjusting the mirrors while Rogers took the passenger seat and Morris climbed in the back. Rogers checked his rifle one more time before looking over at Flint. "You done anything like this before, Sergeant?" Rogers asked. "Drove a car off a dock into a river about 12 hours ago," Flint replied. Rogers stared at him for a moment, trying to figure out if he was serious. "He's not joking," Morris said from the back seat. Davis pulled his SUV alongside Flint's and gave him a thumbs up through the window. Flint returned it before pressing the accelerator and pulling away from the barricade. The 2 vehicles turned east, crossing the bridge and entering the east side of the city. The road leading to the airport was a 4-lane boulevard that cut through a commercial district. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a straight shot, but abandoned vehicles forced Flint to weave through the lanes, cutting around wrecks and debris that had been left behind during the initial panic. The storefronts on either side were dark and damaged, and scattered creatures wandered between the buildings, turning to watch the vehicles pass. "Don't stop for anything," Davis said over the radio. Flint kept his foot on the gas, swerving around a minivan that sat sideways across both lanes. A ghoul sprinted out from behind it, slamming into the side of the SUV, with enough force to crack the rear window. Morris flinched but kept his composure, watching the creature tumble across the asphalt in the side mirror as they sped away. The airport perimeter fence came into view within minutes, the chain-link barrier stretching along the road ahead. The main entrance was a wide gap in the fence where a security checkpoint had once controlled access. Now the checkpoint booth was destroyed, smashed apart by what looked like a vehicle that had plowed through it at high speed. Flint could see the soldiers Conrad had mentioned. A small group dug in behind a pair of trucks just inside the entrance. They were firing in short bursts at a crowd of creatures that was pressing toward their position from the airfield side. Even from a distance, Flint could tell they were running low. The gaps between their volleys were getting longer as they conserved what little ammunition they had left. "I see the team. They're still holding, but not for long," Flint reported over the radio. "Push through and don't slow down. Give them a honk so they know we're friendly," Davis ordered. Flint laid on the horn as they approached the entrance, blasting past the checkpoint and onto the airport access road. The soldiers at the barricade looked over in surprise, one of them waving as the 2 SUVs roared past their position and onto the airfield. The moment they cleared the entrance barricade, the full scale of the problem became apparent. The runway stretched out before them, a wide expanse of concrete that should have been empty. Instead, it was swarming with creatures. Hundreds of them were scattered across the tarmac, milling around abandoned aircraft, luggage carts, and fuel trucks. The noise of the SUV engines rippled through the horde like a shockwave, and within seconds, dozens of heads turned in their direction. "Jesus!" Rogers muttered. Flint gripped the wheel tighter as the first wave of ghouls began sprinting toward them. The creatures were fast, closing distance at a full run, with their arms pumping at their sides. He swerved around the first group, the SUV's tires squealing on the concrete as he cut hard to the left. A zombie slammed into the front quarter panel, spinning off the vehicle and disappearing under the wheels of Davis's SUV behind them. More were coming from every direction now, pouring out from between parked aircraft and around the corners of terminal buildings. "We can't get through this way. There's too many of them between us and the baggage area," Flint said over the radio. "I see it. Hold on. I'm looking for an alternate route," Davis replied. Flint kept driving, weaving between creatures and obstacles as the horde continued to converge on their position. A fuel truck blocked the taxiway ahead, forcing him to cut across the grass median between runways. The SUV bounced hard over the uneven ground, the suspension groaning as they hit a drainage ditch and launched briefly into the air before slamming back down. "There, south side. I can see a hangar with the doors open," Davis called out over the radio. Flint spotted it. A large aircraft hangar sat at the far south end of the airfield, its main doors partially open. It was well past the baggage area they had originally been targeting, but it was the only structure within reach that wasn't surrounded by a wall of ghouls. "I see it. Heading there now," Flint confirmed. He cut the wheel hard to the right, pointing the SUV directly at the hangar and flooring the accelerator. The engine roared as they picked up speed, plowing through a pair of creatures that had gotten into their path. The impacts jolted the vehicle but didn't slow it down. Rogers lowered his window and leaned out, firing his rifle at the ghouls that were running alongside the vehicle. His shots were rushed, most of them hitting torsos rather than heads, but the impacts knocked the creatures off stride and bought them a few extra seconds. "Save your ammo for when it counts, Private," Morris said. Rogers pulled himself back inside, his face flushed with adrenaline as the hangar entrance grew larger through the windshield. The gap in the hangar doors wasn't open wide enough for the SUVs to squeeze through, forcing the soldiers to park at the side of the building. Every man bolted from the vehicles, rushing around the corner to the front door. The hangar was large, built to house commercial aircraft, though none were inside at the moment. Tool chests, maintenance scaffolding, and parts bins lined the walls. The space was dim, lit only by the daylight spilling through the gap in the main doors and a row of grimy skylights in the roof. "Everybody out. Secure the space," Davis ordered. The team spread across the hangar with their weapons raised. Flint moved to the left wall while Morris and Butler swept right. Rogers and Silva covered the center, checking behind equipment and under scaffolding for any creatures that might have wandered inside. "Clear left," Flint called out. "Clear right," Morris confirmed. "Center clear," Rogers added. Davis let out a breath and walked toward the main doors, looking out through the gap at the runway beyond. What he saw made him stop cold. The horde had followed them. Creatures were pouring across the tarmac toward the hangar, drawn by the sound of the engines and the gunfire. The front runners were already within 100 yards of the doors and closing fast. "We need to close these doors, now," Davis said. Flint and Morris rushed to the doors, each grabbing one side and pulling. The heavy steel panels moved on a track system, but they were old and poorly maintained. The rollers caught and stuck, requiring both men to throw their full weight into the effort to get them moving. The doors crawled closed, inch by agonizing inch, as the sound of pounding footsteps grew louder outside. Flint could see the ghouls through the narrowing gap, their vacant eyes locked onto the hangar as they sprinted across the last 50 yards of open ground. Come on, Flint muttered through gritted teeth. Butler and Silva ran over to help, adding their strength to the effort. The four of them hauled on the doors as Rogers stood in the shrinking gap, his rifle raised and ready. The first zombie reached the entrance when the gap was still about 3 feet wide. Rogers pulled the trigger, putting a round through its forehead and dropping it in the doorway. A second creature was right behind it, scrambling over the body to get through. Rogers fired again, this one catching the ghoul in the temple and spraying the doorframe with blood. "Keep pulling," Davis shouted. The gap narrowed to 2 feet, then 1. A zombie arm shot through the remaining space, clawing at the air. Morris shoved his shoulder against the door, crushing the arm between the 2 panels. The bone snapped with an audible crack, but the creature kept reaching, its fingers grasping at nothing. With a final heave, the doors slammed shut. Butler grabbed a length of chain from a nearby workbench and began threading it through the door handles, securing it as tightly as he could. For a moment, the team stood there, breathing hard and listening. Then the pounding started, fists against steel, dozens of them, hammering on the doors from the outside. The sound filled the hangar, reverberating off the walls and ceiling until it felt like the entire building was shaking. "That chain's not going to hold forever," Morris said. "It doesn't have to. It just has to hold long enough for us to figure out our next move," Davis replied. Before anyone could respond, a loud crash echoed from the far side of the hangar. The team spun around, weapons raised, as a side door near the back wall burst open. The frame had been weakened by rust and age, and the weight of the creatures pressing against it from outside was more than enough to break through. Zombies spilled into the hangar, tripping over each other as they pushed through the narrow doorway. The first ones through scrambled to their feet and locked onto the soldiers, letting out excited moans as they broke into a sprint. "Contact rear!" Flint shouted. The team opened fire, but more creatures kept flooding through the broken door. For every one they dropped, 2 more appeared behind it, pushing past the fallen bodies and into the hangar. Davis looked from the failing front doors to the overrun back entrance, his jaw set tight as the situation closed in around them from both sides. "Find us a way out of this, Flint!" Davis shouted over the gunfire. Flint's eyes swept the hangar, searching for anything that could save them as the horde pressed in from 2 directions.